The rain came down in sheets that night, the kind of cold, relentless Ohio storm that silences everything but the wind. Detective Mark Harris gripped the steering wheel of his cruiser, eyes narrowing through the haze of wipers and lightning. The radio crackled with static, dispatch cutting through. Unit 3 to 12, single vehicle collision. Route 19, near the old quarry. Possible entrapment. It was supposed to be routine, another late-night accident on a lonely road, but something in the dispatcher's tone felt wrong. Mark had been on the force 15 years. He'd seen the aftermath of drunk driving, domestic calls gone wrong, the occasional overdose. Nothing surprised him anymore. But as he turned off the main highway and the asphalt gave way to gravel, a strange unease crept up his spine. The storm had knocked out the streetlights. His headlights swept over a mangled shape at the bend in the road. What was once a silver sedan, now wrapped around a utility pole like crumpled foil. He parked, stepped out, and the wind nearly tore the door from his hand. Red and blue lights flickered off the twisted metal, painting the rain in color. Steam hissed from the shattered hood. Somewhere beneath the noise, he heard it. A faint, uneven breath. Mark rushed forward, peering through the broken window. A young woman, maybe 25, slumped against the steering wheel. Her hair was soaked with rain and blood. He called out, "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. For a moment, their eyes met. Then, barely audible through the roar of the storm, she whispered a single word. "Evan." Her head dropped. The pulse in her wrist was thin, fading. He shouted for the paramedics who were just pulling in behind him. They worked fast, calling out vitals, cutting her free, lifting her onto a stretcher. Mark backed away as they began chest compressions. The rain mixed with the metallic smell of blood and gasoline. He heard one medic murmur, "We're losing her." The siren wailed as the ambulance sped toward Riverside Memorial. 40 minutes later, Mark was still writing his report under the shelter of his car's headlights when the radio buzzed again. "Unit 3 to 12, we need you to confirm a detail from the earlier call. Also, stand by for another dispatch." "Same location?" Mark frowned. "Same location?" he asked. The line went quiet. Then the voice came again, hesitant. "Yes, sir." Another vehicle reported. Same make, same license plate. At first, he thought it had to be an error. Maybe the database had glitched. But when he arrived back at Route 19, his stomach dropped. There it was, the same sedan, the same pole, the same exact scene, except this time the woman was standing outside the car, soaked, shivering, but alive. Not a scratch on her. Mark froze. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you hurt?" She turned to him, confusion on her face. I'm fine," she said softly. "You were here earlier, weren't you?" Her voice was calm, eerily calm. Behind him, the other officers exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered, wasn't she?" But no one finished the sentence. The rain slowed to a mist. The paramedic from before stared at the woman in disbelief. "That's not possible," he muttered. Mark didn't know what to say. The world felt suspended, as if time itself had hesitated. In 15 years on the force, he had trusted evidence, procedure, and logic. But that night, standing on the same wet asphalt, staring at a woman who should not have been alive, he felt something he hadn't in years. Fear. And deep down, he knew, whatever this was, it wasn't over. Before that night, Detective Mark Harris lived a life built on order, a life measured in shift rotations, case files, and the quiet discipline of a man who believed every mystery had an answer. He'd been with the Dayton Police Department since his early 20s, starting as a patrol officer fresh out of the academy. Over the years, he'd built a reputation for level-headedness, the kind of cop who could walk into chaos and find the thread of truth hidden inside it. He wasn't the type to tell ghost stories at the bar after shift. He didn't believe in luck or fate. For Mark, the world made sense when it was written down in ink, when every fact fit neatly into a report. But beneath that controlled exterior lived a quiet grief that shaped everything he did. When Mark was 19, his younger brother Daniel was killed by a drunk driver just a few miles from home. That night had rewritten his understanding of loss. It was the reason he'd joined the force. Not out of a sense of adventure, but duty. He never wanted another family to get the call his parents had received. The years that followed hardened him in ways he didn't notice at first. The faces of the dead blurred together. The sound of crying mothers became background noise. He learned to compartmentalize, to leave each tragedy at the scene, to separate emotion from duty. That was the only way to survive in uniform. But over time, those walls built something else too. Distance. Distance from his wife, who left after 12 years of marriage, and from his daughter, who'd grown up mostly watching her father drive away into the night. When he spoke about it later, Mark would say, "You don't realize how much of yourself you trade for the badge until you've got nothing left to take off." His tone carried no bitterness, only a tired understanding that it was the man who arrived at Route 19 that night, rational, grounded, and trained to see through panic. He had responded to hundreds of crashes before, each one tragic but explainable. But when Jessica Cole opened her eyes after dying in his arms, everything he thought he knew about life and death began to unravel. In the weeks that followed, Mark tried to bury himself in work. Paperwork, patrols, routine. But his mind kept circling back to that name she whispered. Evan. It echoed in his head during long, silent drives through empty streets. He told himself it was just trauma, an anomaly, a medical error. Yet something deeper gnawed at him. The feeling that logic had slipped that night, that the rules he'd trusted all his life had suddenly bent. For the first time in 15 years, Mark couldn't close a case, because this wasn't just another incident to file away. It was personal, haunting, impossible, and real. Her name was Jessica Cole, 26 years old, an art teacher at a local high school, known for her warmth and her soft laugh. When Mark first read her name in the official report, it struck him how ordinary it sounded. Another name in a long list of victims. But when he saw her face again, alive and breathing, the name stopped being a line on paper. It became something extraordinary. The morning after the crash, Mark drove to Riverside Memorial Hospital, still unsure if what he'd seen was a product of exhaustion or something far stranger. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and coffee, the kind of place where time always felt suspended. Nurses moved briskly down the hall, their expressions unreadable. Mark asked for Jessica Cole. The receptionist looked at him confused. Room 214, she said. She's doing fine. Fine, the word didn't make sense. Less than 12 hours earlier, he had watched her die. He had heard the paramedic call the time of death. But there she was, sitting up in bed, her skin unmarked, her breathing steady. The monitors beside her beeped in calm, rhythmic tones. No broken bones, no bruises, no sign of trauma at all. When she looked up and saw Mark, her expression softened, recognition flashing in her eyes. You were there, she said quietly. Her voice was gentle, fragile. At the car, Mark hesitated. You remember me? Jessica nodded. You tried to keep me awake. You said, stay with me. She looked down, her hands trembling slightly. I heard you. The nurse nearby froze. She hadn't been told about that. Mark glanced at the chart clipped to the end of the bed. Time of death, 10:43 p.m. The signature of the ER physician, Dr. Alan Brooks, was scrawled beneath it. Yet there she was, alive, her pulse steady under the nurse's fingertips. When Mark finally spoke to Dr. Brooks, the man looked shaken. Detective, I've been a physician for 20 years. I know what death looks like. He rubbed his temples. Her heart stopped for nearly 40 minutes. No oxygen to the brain. We followed every protocol. Defibrillation, epinephrine, nothing worked. We called it, he paused, his voice dropping. But this morning, the nurse found her breathing. Just breathing, like nothing had happened. Mark asked the obvious question. Could there have been an error? Maybe a false reading? Brooks shook his head. We checked everything. Multiple leads. Monitors were accurate. There's no medical explanation for this. Later, Mark found himself in the hospital cafeteria, staring at his untouched coffee as rain streaked down the window. Around him, life went on as usual, nurses laughing to the distant beep of monitors. But for him, the world had shifted. He couldn't reconcile what he had seen with what he knew to be real. Before leaving, he returned to Jessica's room. She was sketching quietly, a faint pencil outline taking shape on her notepad, a portrait of a man in uniform. When Mark asked, she smiled faintly. That's Evan, she said. My fiancé. He died last year in Afghanistan. The air seemed to tighten between them. That's the name you said, Mark murmured. At the crash. Jessica nodded, eyes glistening. He was there with me, just before everything went black. Elsewhere in the hospital, whispers had already begun. An ER nurse swore she had zipped the body bag herself. Another said she'd seen Jessica's flatline on the monitor. Yet there she was, breathing, talking, sketching. Mark walked out of Riverside Memorial that day into a gray morning, rain still falling in a thin mist. He had entered the hospital as a skeptic. But as the automatic doors closed behind him, he realized something unsettling. If Jessica's survival defied science, then maybe the truth wasn't in the hospital's records at all. Maybe it was somewhere far beyond them. In the days that followed, Detective Mark Harris did what he'd always done best. He investigated. Facts, reports, witness statements, the comforting structure of logic. It was his way of bringing order back to a world that suddenly felt like it had slipped its axis. He started with the basics. The crash report was straightforward. One vehicle, no other cars involved, no skid marks to suggest braking. The impact speed, calculated by the traffic unit, was nearly 70 miles per hour. The utility pole had splintered from the force. No one should have survived that. The photos from the night told the same story. Twisted steel, shattered glass, a crushed driver's side. Mark returned to the impound lot where the car sat under a gray tarp. The smell of oil and rain still clung to the metal. He lifted the cover and stared at the wreckage, the seatbelt sliced by the paramedics who tried to save her. The airbag was burned, bloodstained. Yet the woman who'd been pulled from it had no scars, no fractures, not even a bruise. He traced the VIN number. It matched the plate, the registration, everything aligned. No clerical mistake. This was the same car, the same crash. The same woman. The next stop was the hospital. He asked for every report, every recording from that night. The ER log confirmed what he already knew. Jessica Cole had been declared dead at 10:43 p.m. Her heart showed no electrical activity for 40 minutes. But at 11:27 p.m., a nurse making final rounds had found her breathing. No defibrillator. No intervention. Her heart had simply restarted. Mark met with Dr. Amanda Shaw, a neurologist known for her research in post-cardiac recovery. She studied the file with furrowed brows. Cases like this are almost non-existent, she explained. There's something called Lazarus syndrome, spontaneous return of circulation after death has been declared. But it's rare, and even then, patients don't come back like this. Mark leaned forward. Meaning? Meaning, she said. Even if circulation restarts, there's almost always severe brain damage. No one comes back fully intact. Yet her scans are clean. No hypoxia. No swelling. It's as if her brain never went without oxygen. He pressed her for answers. Could hypothermic shock from the rain have slowed her metabolism enough to protect her organs? Dr. Shaw shook her head. The temperature that night wasn't low enough. And even then, the physical injuries she sustained, they don't just vanish. The word vanish lingered. Mark remembered her smooth skin, her calm expression, as if she'd never even been in a crash. Back at the station, he spread the evidence across his desk. Photographs, witness notes, copies of medical charts. Every piece told the same story. Jessica Cole had died. And then, inexplicably, she hadn't. Mark felt a gnawing tension, the collision between what could be proven and what he'd seen with his own eyes. The system he trusted, the world of facts and sequence, suddenly had a fracture running right through the middle. He closed the file but left it on his desk. It didn't feel finished. He couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was still calling him back to that road, to that moment, and deep down he knew the truth wouldn't be found in paperwork. It would be found in her. When Mark finally gathered the courage to visit Jessica again, weeks had passed since the crash. She had been discharged, her recovery described by doctors as complete and spontaneous. There were no follow-up surgeries, no therapy sessions, no medication. She was fine, at least physically. But when Mark entered her small apartment, something in her eyes told him the story wasn't over. She greeted him with a faint smile and offered tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. The room was warm and filled with sketches. Portraits, landscapes, half-finished canvases leaning against the wall. Yet many of them shared one recurring image. The same empty road, slick with rain, under a sky split by lightning. "I remember you," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "You were the one who tried to keep me awake." Mark nodded. "You told me a name, Evan." Her gaze fell to the floor. "He was my fiancé. He died last year in Afghanistan. I thought I'd made peace with it. But that night, when everything went dark, he was there." Mark leaned forward, his voice steady. "Jessica, what do you mean he was there?" She took a deep breath. "I don't mean in a dream. I mean really there. I could see him. I was standing on the road, but it wasn't raining anymore. Everything was still, quiet. And I looked down and saw my car. Saw you kneeling beside me." Her voice cracked. "I saw my body. The air in the room seemed to thicken." Mark didn't move. Jessica continued, her words slow, deliberate. "You were talking to me, telling me to hold on. I remember your badge. 2173. The paramedic's watch was broken, the glass cracked across the face. I saw it when he leaned over me." She looked up, eyes shining with certainty. "And then I heard it, the sound of the heart monitor going flat. I knew it was mine." Mark felt the hairs on his neck rise. Every detail she described, the broken watch, the code the paramedics used to declare time of death, even the faint smell of burnt rubber from the crash site, was accurate. Details no patient could ever know. "What happened next?" he asked quietly. Jessica's expression softened. "Evan was standing in front of me. He didn't speak at first. He just smiled. That same smile he had before deployments. Then he said, 'You're not done yet. You have more to do.'" Her voice trembled. I tried to follow him, but I couldn't move. And then it felt like being pulled backward. Like every sound and color collapsed into one blinding flash. The next thing I knew, I woke up here. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Psychologists would later call it a near-death experience, or NDE, a phenomenon documented in medical journals, but never fully understood. Some theories linked it to chemical surges in the dying brain, others to hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation. But Jessica's case didn't fit those explanations. Her brain had shown no trauma. Mark left her apartment with the unsettling realization that she hadn't imagined any of it. Her account wasn't vague or dreamlike. It was specific, measurable, impossible. That night, as he drove home through the same rain-soaked streets, her words echoed in his mind. "You're not done yet." He didn't know if she meant herself or him. Months passed, but the memory of that night refused to fade. For Detective Mark Harris, it became a presence, a quiet shadow that followed him everywhere he went. The case file still sat on his desk, corners worn from how often he'd opened it, reread it, stared at it as if repetition might make the impossible make sense. But every time he did, the facts remained unchanged. Jessica Cole had died, and then she hadn't. Life around him carried on. Routine calls, reports, morning coffee in the station break room. Yet the ordinary world now felt thinner, more fragile, as though beneath the paperwork and protocols lay something vast and unknowable. He caught himself glancing at people on the street, wondering how many had brushed against that same invisible line between life and death. Jessica had returned to teaching. Occasionally, she would send him photos of her art students' work or the murals they'd painted together at the local youth center. She said she'd started living differently, slower, gentler, more grateful. When you've seen the other side, she once told him, every moment feels like a gift someone decided to give back. Mark didn't reply right away, because for him it wasn't peace he felt. It was unrest, the kind that comes from standing too close to a truth you can't explain. Late one evening, unable to sleep, he sat at his kitchen table surrounded by papers. He began searching online for similar medical anomalies. He found hundreds. People declared dead for minutes, hours, even days who later revived. Most were explained by medical error or rare biological events, but a handful weren't. He read about Pam Reynolds, a woman who described details of her surgery while clinically dead during a brain operation. He read about Lazarus syndrome, that rare, spontaneous restart of the heart after failed resuscitation. Doctors called it auto-resuscitation after failed cardiopulmonary resuscitation. But even that couldn't account for Jessica's lack of injury or her vivid recollections. Eventually, Mark found himself in the office of Dr. Amanda Shaw again. She listened quietly as he spoke, her brow furrowed in that same thoughtful way. "Detective," she said softly, "sometimes medicine isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. There are things we don't yet have the tools to measure. Consciousness might be one of them." Her words stayed with him. Incomplete. A few weeks later, Mark drove out to the crash site for the first time since that night. The utility pole had been replaced. Grass had grown over the scars in the earth. Jessica's flowers, bright daisies tied with a thin ribbon, were placed at the base of the new pole. He stood there in silence, listening to the hum of distant cars. He realized then that the thing haunting him wasn't death. It was the idea that death might not be an ending at all, that maybe, somewhere beyond the evidence, something kept going, something that didn't care about reports or physics or rules. When he turned to leave, he caught sight of a small sketch tucked beneath the flowers, a pencil drawing of a police officer kneeling in the rain beside a wrecked car. Underneath, in neat handwriting, were 3 words. "Thank you, Mark." Years later, the case still sits in a weathered folder on the top shelf of Mark Harris's bookshelf, its edges soft, the ink on the cover fading with time. He's long since retired now, living in a modest home outside Columbus, surrounded by framed photographs of his daughter, his grandchildren, and the occasional newspaper clipping from his years on the force. Yet, despite all the memories that time has taken, that one night on Route 19 remains sharp, unblurred, untouched by the years. Sometimes, when storms roll in and the rain drums against the windows, he finds himself standing at the glass, watching the lightning split the sky. He always remembers how the rain fell that night, heavy, relentless, alive. And in those moments, he swears he can still see the red and blue reflections on the wet asphalt, still hear the faint voice of a young woman whispering a single name into the dark. "You spend a career trying to make sense of chaos," he says softly in voiceover, his older tone steady but weighted with reflection. "You tell yourself every story has a reason, every crime a motive, every death a cause. But sometimes the truth doesn't want to be caught." After his retirement, Mark agreed to speak publicly about the case for a documentary investigating near-death experiences. It was the first time he'd ever allowed himself to revisit the details fully. The producers expected a ghost story. What they got instead was something quieter, more unsettling, a man still searching for peace in a world where not every mystery can be solved. When asked whether he believed Jessica's story, Mark paused for a long moment. "I believe she experienced something real," he said finally. "Something that medicine couldn't record and science couldn't replicate. Maybe it was her brain firing its last sparks. Maybe it was something else. But whatever it was, it changed her. And it changed me." In one of the final scenes, we see Jessica Cole years later, sitting in a sunlit backyard, her young daughter laughing beside her as she paints on a canvas. Her smile carries no shadow of that night. Yet her voice, when she speaks, still trembles with quiet awe. "I used to be afraid of dying," she says. "Now I'm afraid of not living enough," as the camera lingers on the painting she's working on, a rain-soaked road beneath. A silver sky, her voice fades. Beneath the sound of thunder in the distance, back in his home, Mark closes the folder one last time. He doesn't need to look inside anymore. The truth isn't in the paperwork. It's in what can't be written, in the unanswered space between heartbeats, between the living and the gone. He looks out the window, watching the storm ease into silence. "I've seen what the end looks like," his voice says in the final line. "And maybe it's not the end at all." Fade to black.